Olá a todas e a todos, meu nome é Luísa Fanaro, eu sou doutoranda em Antropologia Social na Universidade Federal de São Carlos e é com muito prazer que eu apresento mais um diálogo da Oitava React. O diálogo de hoje, Prospecção, Extração e Conversão de Animais em Mercadorias, contará com as presenças de David Jaclan, Juliana Fausto e Guilherme Sá. Após a exibição de um vídeo produzido por David Jaclan, os três pesquisadores realizarão um debate a respeito dessa produção. David Jaclan é professor na Escola de Estudos Sociológicos e Antropológicos da Universidade de Ottawa, onde ele dirige o Human Animal Lab, e sua pesquisa se baseia em processos informacionais e comunicacionais envolvidos nas relações entre humanos e animais. Atualmente, ele trabalha em dois projetos, um sobre o tráfico internacional de animais silvestres exóticos e a criminalidade verde alimentada por esse mercado, e o outro sobre biomídia e os futuros digitais e artificiais de organismos vivos e modificados. Juliana Fausto é pós-doutoranda no programa de pós-graduação em filosofia da Universidade Federal do Paraná, onde ela atua como professora visitante e ministra disciplinas nos níveis de graduação e pós-graduação em filosofia. Ela também é autora do livro A Cosmopolítica dos Animais e desenvolve pesquisa na área de filosofia e a questão ambiental, com destaque à relação dos animais outros que humanos com a política e a área de estudos feministas. Guilherme Sá é professor do Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade de Brasília, onde ele lidera o grupo de pesquisa Laboratório de Antropologia da Ciência e da Técnica. Ele também foi pesquisador convidado no Laboratório de Antropologia Social no Collège de France e investigador visitante do Instituto de Ciências Sociais da Universidade de Lisboa. Guilherme é autor do livro No Mesmo Galho, Antropologia de Coletivos Humanos e Animais, e as suas pesquisas giram em torno de temas da antropologia da ciência e tecnologia e das relações entre humanos e animais. Gostaria, sim, de agradecer a participação do David, da Juliana e do Guilherme, e também de todas e todos que estão nos assistindo. E, sem mais demoras, a gente passa agora à exibição do vídeo e, na sequência, ao debate com os três pesquisadores.
Il est arrivé vers nous.
This will be for lion.
And leopard?
And this will be for your smaller cats. There's a jaw, bottom part of a jaw. This will be for a leopard. This is what we use for the buffalo. See, for the buffalo normally. so. Ja. This is for your very small cats, like your Genets and stuff like that. So all the eyes differ as per animal. Wheatback and your mountain wheatback that has a thing called a circumference. That gets built back onto the horn, between the horn and the skull. So it's a little bridge thing. So that gets built on by a specific putty and a specific color that matches it. And that also gets painted. After all that has been done, the horns get polished and the eyes get polished and the nose gets polished. And your ears get painted inside per the color of.
Queria começar agradecendo ao filme que o Jacqueline apresentou a gente e propor a primeira pergunta. David, o que a gente acompanha por mais tempo no seu filme é o trabalho nos olhos sintéticos. Eles causam angústia, seja porque nós, os espectadores, estamos assistindo ao filme com nossos próprios olhos, mas também porque os olhos parecem ser a última fortaleza da vida em um corpo. Olhos vivos, olhos sem vida, olhos de plástico. O regime do olhar está em jogo aí. Lembrei-me também de uma passagem do De Anima, que considero muito bela, quando Aristóteles diz, no livro 2, em 412 B1, que se o olho fosse um animal, a pupila seria o corpo e a visão seria a alma. Portanto, tenho duas perguntas aqui. Uma sobre a importância da escolha e a colocação correta do olho nesse animal mercantilizado, que parece emular uma alma em um cadáver muito morto. O que você acha disso? E a outra é mais sobre a realização do filme. Como o nexo de alienações entre corpos e práticas é apresentado cinematograficamente aos espectadores, daqueles olhos sem vida e sintéticos aos nossos?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So the question of the eyes, or the question of the gaze, the commerce of look. We ended up. It was among a bigger fieldwork, but we ended up crashing in this place one day. And I might talk how we ended up there, but this is an interesting and scary place at the same time, where most of the trophies, so the dead animals, are turned into something that's more palatable for living rooms around the world, where people can display their catch. So we, most of the time, end up seeing the end product of a long series of gestures over dead bodies that are trying to be resurrected. And we thought it was very important to stop along every single step to see what's this weird story about reanimating a dead animal. So killing it in the first place and trying to have it alive again, but along specific lines with a very drastic grammar, after a series of interventions. So the little film is more about field notes put together rather than film itself, but it's also like a proposition, like a relational object, where we can ask questions based on those little gestures that, when put together, end up forming a weird creature, and a creature that becomes a creature almost at the end of the process, when the eye is put on. And those eyes are synthetic. They come in a package with a barcode, and they're very standard. You've got an eye for impalas and eyes for cheetahs. So every single species has a specific type of eyes, and they say nothing about the animal itself, but rather the look that the animal is supposed to have, because it belongs to a specific species. So this combination of looks that are all artificial was very intriguing to us. And thanks for bringing back Aristotle. It seems like every time we're talking about animals, we end up talking about the soul. In that case, it's a resurrection, soul searching, and the idea of the eyes was to me parallel to the idea of filming, or the idea of seeing other people through a medium, kind of what we're doing today with those online conversations, where we look, but we also hear and feel and think, but all that is mediated by a disposal, by a setup of some sort. And in the case of the taxidermy workshop, we end up having this weird parallel, where we look at the animal that is tried to get back his look, in order for this animal to be displayed in a living room where other people, hosts and hunters, can look at the animal. So it felt like a little theater stage, or at least the staging was important to me, because it tells a lot about what we think an animal is or is not. So if you kill it and you try to resurrect it, what form that animal is going to take. And in the workshop, you see very different and weird poses for different animals. They're all staged into something that's supposed to describe them. So big cats have this very scary and powerful allure, but it doesn't work. It's very fake in the end. So that process of fabricating looks based on ideas, or it's almost like a cosmological thing, the way we think animals should look, that I was very intrigued in the process, the actual succession of gestures in order to put eyes on a dead animal to resurrect it.
Ok, David, muito obrigado pela resposta. Eu vou dar sequência aqui nas próximas questões. Bom, em primeiro lugar, obrigado pelo convite. Prazer estar aqui com vocês, amigos da React. Bom, David, é interessante a justaposição e sobreposição dos moldes de espuma, aqueles ainda sem as peles, em composição com os contornos dos troncos das árvores que aparecem nas imagens. Há um jogo de texturas ali, um jogo também de materiais compósitos e inorgânicos, né? Espuma, ligas de aço, e também de decompósitos orgânicos, né? As árvores e as peles. A cena me parece uma interessante assemblagem de quadros entre a natureza morta, né, dos troncos, e, no caso dos animais taxidermizados, de espécies de naturezas prototípicas que estão em progresso. Se você pudesse falar um pouquinho mais sobre isso.
Yes, this idea of composing something which usually belongs to art was also puzzling. So you enter into a place where corpses made of foam are supposed to give you the basic measures of what the trophy will look like. So it was interesting to see that every dead animal was turned into a skin, and that skin was fitted on a mold. And at the end of the fitting, the eyes and maybe a little traits here and there are added in order for the animal to look alive. And this distinction between the animal and the animated aspect of a dead body was key to me in order to better grasp the imagination that surrounds those hunting sequences or hunting experiences or game, as they call it. So those animals were not animals; they were games, and this play between forms and the life that's breathing through that form was very consistent all around the steps, as if all the time the animals had to fit not just the mold but a box. So in that part of the world, most of the animals that you see in the little film are migratory animals. What they're doing is that they're covering important distances, but they can't do that anymore because most of the land is fenced. And the consequences of that is that people owning the land, the fenced land, have to, because it's fenced, manage what they call game management. And part of that management is allowing people with permits and a lot of money involved to hunt specific animals. Some places it's done at the end of a pickup truck with someone holding a rifle and the animal being right there at the right moment. In other places, it's more athletic, so you got to walk with your rifle or your weapon in order to hunt the animal. And so right from the beginning, those animals have a designated space within the land, but also within the psychic brains that we all carry between our shoulders. And that place is constantly negotiated by animals and people. And the taxidermy place is just one little part or bit of a longer chain of circulation where the life of animals is feeding an industry. But I thought that this little place was very not just revealing, because so we're talking about resurrection and revelation, so this is kind of a specific vocabulary, but it tells the anthropologist many things, and I guess every single human being a lot of things too, because you see an animal that's charged with history and passion and phantasm and ideas being turned into a dead but alive thing at the same time. So it was interesting to see how from the beginning, being on those fenced areas, to the end, sitting in the living room, the animal has no room to breathe. And this very specific aspect of hunting was key to me, especially because hunting is supposed to be a double direction kind of interaction, where hunting is exciting because you're not sure you're going to be able to get the animal. But in this place, the animal was dead from the beginning, because when you buy a permit, you have the insurance that you're going to catch something. So this space created by this industry along the way has to be filled up by life and by lives. And the taxidermy place was the end of that long process where the loop was looped. And it has to be made with organic matter, but also inorganic matter. And that's this artificiality of things that was, I think, very puzzling in this place. So the passages, the constant passages between something that's alive and has to die in order to become something else that's also alive, but has to be dead for that. So maybe the basic philosophical difference between being and existing was there very clear, and we were intrigued by that.
This is a long question, I'm sorry for that. Eu fiquei pensando numa possível analogia entre a caça feita para museus, né, para exposições públicas, produção de conhecimento, e a caça para troféus, exposição particular, para o próprio ego, talvez. O que ambos têm em comum? Se pensarmos na história dos zoológicos e museus naturais, aprendemos que o colonialismo e a conquista desempenharam um papel importante no tráfico e na caça de animais nas colônias. O que você acha que está em jogo aqui? A cultura conquistando a natureza? Podemos identificar o mesmo mito de origem que cria subhumanidades e não humanidades dentro do colonialismo nas narrativas evolutivas de uma humanidade adequada, uma humanidade própria, pessoas escravizadas e feras selvagens, seres exóticos primitivos em geral. Afinal, esses animais não vêm apenas de lugares que sofreram e ainda estão sofrendo com os processos coloniais e figuraram, continuam figurando a própria terra e seus povos a serem conquistados, mas os próprios grupos humanos que serviram e servem como mão de obra escravizada, servil e ou barata, como guias, como os taxidermistas que a gente viu no filme e etc. Quais as diferenças que fazem a diferença? Quais as continuidades e rupturas entre os animais empalhados do Museu de História Natural e os troféus, diante dos contínuos processos de expropriação e exploração em que, a nível nacional e pessoal, os atores envolvidos nessas histórias estão capturados?
So it's a rather long question, but a very important one. So thank you for that. Continuities and discontinuities between those places where taxidermy was first displayed or massively displayed, and the entering into individual homes of those animals, but following the same kind of tradition where you kill, you clean, and then you display something that is supposed to represent a category, a specific category in this respect, the species of an animal species. In the film, what we, I think, were sensitive to is how you can produce images that are not made for representation only, but so what I try to call image imagination. So you're producing images that are opening up your imagination rather than fixing an idea and putting it out there for people to think that, okay, this is how it looks like. So if we go back to the first idea of this commerce of looks between all the creatures that are involved in this part of the world, that commerce has been fixed into specific ideas of what an animal is supposed to be and a human is supposed to be or not be. So conservationists and hunters are fighting for the future of many creatures down there. So what we were trying to do is being conscious of this heavy weight of history and that colonial aspect of everything down there. How could we try to be sensitive of things that are not told usually? So in this specific workshop, we concentrate since the beginning on animals and on the processes through which a specific animal is going in order to be resurrected. But within those very little steps, or within those differences that are making a differences, there are gestures. And in this case, gestures by workers. And those workers are having a very interesting relationship with animals. They're part of an industry. There are obvious power relationship, historical, economical, political, racist, that goes with those gestures all along the line. But I was also sensitive to the way they could escape that stereotyping. In other words, when you try to portray something or gesture or relationship, how can you, without being conscious of those power relationship, how can you also suggest an exit or a difference that can make another kind of difference? And in this case, I was very sensitive to the slowness and the agility that most of the workers were showing at every single step of the transformation. So every station was a place for some craft. And in some places that craft is bloody, because every single step is made in order to remove all the fluids, all the things that are circulating within an animal to keep him alive, keep it alive, and remove that in order to fix it and to render it static. But those gestures are very dynamic. And we thought that by looking at those gestures, first and foremost, we were able to look at this colonial, big, massive history differently. So about the natural history museums, I think that craft of taxidermy has a long history, and it's something very difficult to achieve. I remember visiting a place in the Boston area of the bad taxidermized animals, and it's very interesting to see what you could do and also what you can't do when you don't know exactly how to do it. So that trick of rendering this air or this look or these postures alive is a high craft. And in this case, it didn't look like much. We were in the back of a little shed, a little radio playing, and those guys working on carcasses every single day. They still had this magic into their hands of turning the animal into something else. And I thought that this relationship was very interesting, because it was not just anatomical, it was not just anthropological, it was something else. And to me, it was close to being highly political. And that's what I was trying to investigate a little bit, or at least being sensitive to, by producing images that are not just a denunciation of something that we kind of know now in many parts of the world.
Os olhos e dentições, né, utilizados em alguns animais, são próteses de plástico ou de acrílico, né? E nos seus versos, elas são marcadas e identificadas por códigos de barra. Eu achei uma cena bastante potente e diz muito sobre o capitalismo neo-extrativista, né? A cena final, então, sobre da zebra envolta em plástico bolha, também é um exemplo perturbador disso. Você podia falar um pouquinho mais a respeito desse aspecto?
So in the movie or in the little film, you see at one point the eyes being packaged with the barcode behind, and yeah, it was very telling because you have an entire industry that feeds and operates not only on dead animals but on their parts, and they're trying to recombine that part, which we know because of the history of the industrialization and CAFOs in particular, that the cutting of things in order to build little processes in between, this alienation of the gesture as a long and sorrow tale behind it. And so in the case of those animals, it was very well organized. It was a very lucrative business. But I thought that when you were using all those synthetic things, you could catch or grasp something that's beyond the life of an individual, but something that goes through bodies. And that's the in-betweenness that I was interested in. And it's completely paradoxal because you've got a dead animal that is turned into a trophy in order to look like it's alive, and waits or channel or portrays this ideal of strongness, masculinity of the hunter, and which is very Western. But in between those steps, there is always a hole somewhere where the animal is escaping. And in this case, you're putting a synthetic eye, something that's plastic, into something that's also plastic, the foam, with something that's organic, but it's about to decay, the skin, and you're trying to build a representation of some sort, which you can do by many other ways. You can have a very nice photograph hanged in the wall of your living room. You can go sculpture. There are many ways of having that presence sticking with you. But in that case, and that was very neoliberal, if you'd like, it had to be done by a mode of capture. And to me, it was very important to distinguish between being captured and being captivated. And I think this is this in-betweenness that we're always playing with when we live with animals, or we are becoming animals, depending on the interaction that you choose. There's always this line of control and of letting go, of accepting that something will leak, and it's beautiful, or on the contrary, that you want to control it. And in this place at the end, you see the display room where people can stop by and look around and see what kind of objects they could eventually buy. We ended up going there because we were interested in rhino poaching and the horn business, and we thought it was because of the thin and thinner everyday population of rhinos in that part of the world. It was impossible to hunt a rhino legally. In fact, it is. It's just expensive. But in that place, they were turning the head of a rhino recently poached into a trophy, and the horn was packaged in order to be sent. And that was puzzling to me because it's very difficult to get a permit to export that kind of product. But it's still possible because you got so many ways. So the animal here is not the animal we have in mind. It's not a rhino. It's a rhino plus a series of layers. And I was interested in this addition of layers, in this recomposition among the decomposition of something else. But what was striking to me is that those composition or those composed gestures were always about control, always about imposing something. And at the same time, it was almost the same day at night, we went to see some cave paintings, and it was very striking to see the difference between a wall where lines depicting animals were used to enter in a different kind of communication with animals, and in the taxidermy place, it was like the imprinting on a wall of something that's texturized, as you mentioned, in 3D, and in between, I thought it was pretty clear that you got here a difference in terms of cosmology, and the way you're painting nature, and you're integrating yourself within that realm. And as an anthropologist, I found that fascinating, even though absolutely depressing at some point.
O seu filme, ele existe num espaço fechado, no sentido de que não há planos abertos, né? O filme não situa a gente amplamente, né? A gente está desde o início lançado na observação de uma prática muito determinada, que descobrimos, né, é uma linha de montagem animal, ou de certos animais. Isso vai ao encontro do que a gente conversava na nossa primeira reunião, né, que deu origem a essa mesa, sobre a mercantilização dos animais, quando comentávamos que a própria linha de montagem tem sua origem na observação dos matadouros no Distrito da Carne, em Chicago, e na desmontagem dos corpos de animais, né, na observação da desmontagem, né, desmontagem entre aspas, dos corpos de animais no Distrito da Carne. O que a gente vê no seu filme é o animal como mercadoria sendo montado, né, ou remontado. Você disse remontado diferentemente, né, ou ressuscitado, talvez. Você tinha isso em mente quando você rodou o filme?
So as I mentioned earlier, those shots have been put together in this little film more as field notes, filmed field notes, in order to get that space and time where we could look at those gestures in details. Because when we filmed, it was very difficult, almost impossible to pay attention to those gestures. First of all, because the smell was really heavy, and the only thing you wanted to do is just walk away. It was really unbearable to see that flesh decomposing, and this you can't really see when you look at the film. But being there was a high sensory experience. So we thought, okay, let's take the time to set up the camera and look at what those guys are doing in order to disrupt the guided tour that we had with this young lady. She was in charge of the workshop. We ended up there because in the morning we went to see one of her family member for another reason. So I was interested in the farming of lions. You've got this industry in South Africa where you can buy a permit to hunt a lion, but that lion is not really wild. It has been brought up, tamed, farmed. And the place that we visited that morning was very singular because those people were living with a lion in their house. So we ended up following the lion and the family during a few hours, and in the end of the visit, they offered to show us the taxidermy place, which I was trying to visit or was trying to spend time in a place like this since the beginning of the project. It was very difficult to enter. So we said, okay, yes. And we were guided by this young woman through all the stations. And it was really how she presented the whole process. So first place, the bodies arrive, then they're redistributed through all those places. And at every single station, someone is supposed to do one specific kind of gesture. So we were walked through all those steps where basically you've got a dead body turned into a trophy. But we resisted that. We didn't want to, communicate in a way, because I think that's what she had in mind, that it was a good occasion to communicate about the excellence and the so-called respect that they could have for trophy making. So we stopped the camera and we tried to slow down a little bit that frenzy where you go through dead corpses and it's almost normal to them. So when we did the editing, I was very concerned by the assemblage that we could make, and I was really wondering, how can you still try to produce images, so imagination images and not representational images. So how can we disrupt that in the editing? So we slowed down everything and we try to piece that together in order to pay attention to the gestures themselves. And something happened with just like the camera following the hands and the work of hands that I think was reminiscent of the tradition of CAFOs and industries and stations, and the alienation that we know go with that. But something else to me was there also, and that's what I was trying to pay attention to.
Bem, no filme a gente pode perceber, né, que os trabalhadores têm um conhecimento tremendo a respeito da morfologia dos corpos dos animais com os quais estão lidando, né? Isso faz pensar que se trata de um conhecimento que eles aprenderam talvez com suas famílias, mas que em todo caso diz respeito à sua relação com a terra, né, com aquele lugar propriamente. Enfim, são várias perguntas sobre isso, mas como você vê essa relação? Como a alienação de seus companheiros, outros que humanos, mais que um conhecimento extraído à força pelo capital, ou como uma forma contracolonial de tirar algo, né, dinheiro, daqueles que continuam a usurpar essas terras? Melhor dizendo, né, como você vê a fabricação de espectros animais informados pelo conhecimento ancestral, proveniente de uma relação profunda, mas também antiga, né? Esses espécimes taxidermizados são também entidades que, uma vez viajando para seus caçadores, será que eles os assombrarão? Enfim, essas são algumas pontuações aí que a gente está pensando, David.
So, well, this is probably a big limitation of the work. In order to answer those kind of questions, I would have to spend time with those workers inside the shop and outside the shop to get a better idea of their own relationship to the animal. And I didn't do that, so it's hard for me to say anything about that. What I can say is my experience of the comparison between the gestures in that shop and I don't want to call it a ceremony, but like a little ritual of some sort in those caves that I mentioned earlier, where you have traces of old paintings and a few rituals in order to look at those production. So if you say there is a technological gap in between, so the pigments that are used to draw on those walls within caves are all made of animal fluids. And it's interesting because we also said earlier that in the taxidermy workshop, everything is done to remove those fluids in order for the trophy to look clean. And so those put together, not just by comparison, but to create a space in between, you could really feel the difference in terms of the qualitative difference in terms of the relationship that people have with animals. So remains and fluids of dead animals that have been hunted. In both cases, they're hunted. those dead animals are feeding something else, and that something else was strikingly different. So if we think of the kind of relationship those animals have had with humans for a long time in that part of the world, you see how colonial history and the remains of those powers that are structured within the society are actually feeding something of a very different nature. So the idea of entering in a relationship with an animal through cave painting is in order to get what they call beyond the veil, to a different order of reality that's still there, but that you can't really see. So it's not about visibility, it's about sensing. Whereas in the taxidermy shop, it's almost the inversion. You have to see. You actually don't want to see beyond the trophy because it could be ugly, and that inversion was striking to me. But this is, you know, a story that I am building as an anthropologist. But it's not about the workers themselves, and I'm really sorry to bring, you know, those people without leaving them space to talk and explain how they live with animals. But I thought that filming their hands was a little step in that direction, where you could see the work of the hands and the brain, like this nexus of creation that we all bear. Yeah.
Bom, durante o filme, encontramos cenas muito fortes de peças inacabadas. A impressão é de que se trata de fantasmas ou embriões fantasmagóricos daqueles que não são mais. Na presença da extinção, como você vê a permanência desses cadáveres em forma espectral?
So again, the ghost is returning not to the machine this time, but to the animal. It's really difficult to portray, but the feeling that we all had during that little stay in this place was a feeling of hunting, not hunting, but hunting. That all those walls, tables, buckets were hunted by not just by dead bodies, because one could imagine the number of dead bodies that went through this little workshop, uh, but also by the so maybe the soul that you mentioned earlier on, but something that's very difficult to pinpoint, that might not be communicable by words, and certainly not by something that will, you know, try to analyze this and produce an analysis of it, but rather a feeling, and I'm trying to be as um, as close as possible with my words of that feeling of a haunted place. And so when you see those foams, those molds that have the shape of animals, but it's very hard to know exactly what kind of animals. For instance, you've got a collection of horns at the back, and they all belonged to a specific animal, but they look like a pile of horns, and we saw that frequently during our research, places where they were stored, because they have some value, they last kind of long, but they were piled up, and that's in this piling up, you know, images of camps and charniers and things like that came up to mind. And even if everything is made in order to remove the blood from the process, something bloody was there all the time. So we tried to be receptive to that, and in a way to find modes, so words or images and even sounds, to transduce that feeling. But I think this is something interesting in every case of commodification. In every case of commodification where animals are reduced to an object of exchange, something that can circulate and has a value, there is always that leakage, that opening, that crack, that space, that moment where the ghost or another kind of presence is manifested. And in that workshop, it was pretty clear. And we should ask that question to the other anthropologists that were with me at that time. But I think we're all haunted by that. I mentioned the smell earlier on, and sadly enough, for all those antelopes, the smell is a very important thing, key to their life worlds or their life worlding, and then that smell was also the signal of something heavy and deep too in this workshop.
Bom, David, você escolheu filmar um movimento específico, né, de uma longa cadeia de atividades, que vai da compra de uma licença de caça, ou até mesmo da caça ilegal, até o embarque dos animais troféus para os países dos caçadores. Qual seja, né, você escolheu focar o momento da taxidermia. Creio que isso se deva ao fato de que você quis capturar o momento em que os trabalhadores, né, os trabalhadores negros, transformam os animais em mercadorias. Mas, ao tomar essa decisão, a gente percebe que você excluiu os caçadores potencialmente brancos, né, dessa paisagem. Como foi tomar essa decisão? Como você tomou essa decisão?
Well, thank you for this question. A few things. Maybe the first thing to say is that little film is a budding out of a bigger film, and that's what we went there for, to shoot that film. That's what occupied most of our time in terms of doing field work, filming, recording, sound recording, and then the editing. So it was really like a 5 years process all along. And that little part, the taxidermy place, has maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds in the film. For many reasons, but we decided to produce something else out of the rushes that we had, in order to concentrate on that place specifically with my colleague Darcy D'Angelo. And we worked on that, trying to be as sensitive to hands and not just words, because we had rushes of this young lady telling us everything about the process and the kind of people who were coming to see her and their clients. But in the end, if we put those rushes together, we had only one person talking, and it was a white person. And we felt like it was wrong to go that way. So we removed all the languages, and so you see her hands at some point, and that was fair to me to see hands. You see my hands, her hands, and the hands of the workers. But it was it's not a silent movie or a silent film, but something that's of that sort. So the decision of showing this and not the rest is really it's empirical. Like it came out of the process itself. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's very difficult in South Africa to not be shocked by the way the entire society is divided, organized, and based on the color of your skin, you belong to a place, and you have to, because everything is made for that in that sense, you have to behave in a certain way. So what we could tell about animals and their relationship with the fencing, with the hunters, with the game managers, was pretty correlated in the real life with how humans were organized between themselves, and the biopolitics of all it was traumatizing in many ways. So we okay, that young lady that was giving us a tour was also a hunter herself, and she was a very good friend of another young lady hunter who specialized in what they call relocating animals. So within a fenced area, sometimes you've got too many animals. So based on ecological equations, where you look at the space available, the resources there, the number of animals populating that area, you decide that, oh, we've got too many. So what they are doing is usually they shoot them. And if they can't find hunters to shoot them, they try to sell them. But how do you relocate 100 of wildebeest, for instance, from one place to another? Well, we learned that you use helicopters with huge funnels. They're trying to put all the herd into one specific corner where you open a gate, charge them into a truck, and transport them. And we thought that all this logic behind space, resources, plans to use that space and those resources in a specific with a specific aim in mind was so heavy historically that we don't have much to do to show the relationship and the sometimes direct correlation between that way of organizing animals and the way they were part of an industry today and who were feeding that industry. And so the power relationship in this story was most of the time a decalque of the power relationship we could see around that between humans. So of course that's always the problem when you're trying to follow one story, is that you got so many other stories around that you gotta choose. And in this little film, there's so many things excluded from the workshop. But we also thought that by paying attention to the little gestures, those other things were present. And I tried a little bit to theorize this by thinking in terms of holographic thinking or holographic kind of anthropology, where everything is contained in everything, rather than a descriptive anthropology that was trying to piece together all the pieces. I'm not sure we succeeded, but it was the intention.
Eu queria terminar dizendo que eu fiquei muito impressionada com o filme, que eu gostei demais, e que muitos filmes que têm temas parecidos, ou filmes documentários, que eles mergulham em imagens contendo imagens de choque, imagens de exploração, imagens que são exploradoras, imagens, né, que exploram, por conter essa violência, elas são imagens que exploram também. Então, a minha última pergunta para ele enquanto cineasta, citando a Deborah Bird Rose, outra antropóloga, à sombra de toda essa morte, como é possível criar imagens que não são sensacionalistas, que não são imagens de exploração?
Well, that's the $1 million question. Thanks for asking. This is a very difficult question. First of all, I'm not thinking of myself as a filmmaker, but rather as someone who's working with images in order to get a better grasp or a better thinking of what's happening. So that's part of the ethnographical practice. But this is very personal. But I think we already have seen too many of those gore images, and it's not doing anything. So even if the gore is present all the time, I'm not talking about the wildebeest in the truck being unloaded, all those things that we have been exposed to and that have deeply touched our heart and soul. This is a very personal experience, and even if it's worth sharing it, it's very difficult to do that with images. So instead, what I was trying to develop is another approach where you're working with images, hoping that those images will open up instead of closing up, open up a space for imagination, to show that so many other relationships are possible with animals all around the world, no matter where you're living. This is an ecological concern, an ecological question for all of us. What kind of relationships are we installing with other than humans, creatures living around us? And I don't think there is, one avenue that will be better than another. I think the problem is that there is only one avenue portrayed those days, and it's either the good or the bad avenue. So following up the destiny of those mythical animals in South Africa, we ended up meeting so many different people within such a complex realm of relationships that was holding together that system. And I was thinking that in order to address that, or to get a grasp of that system or that holding together, we could use those imagination images, or images made for open up imagination, rather than just, putting into the face of the viewer the absurdity of the situation, and we know that story. It has been the story of the world for at least the last 4th century, and we know how it works. But what can we open up based on that, rather than just denouncing? And also because it's not, my fight. Who am I to denounce that, right? So I was trying to be very humble and use those images as a way to move forward, rather than as a way to become more and more depressed by what was happening around us, because I think we have enough depression now.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for thinking, so watching, thinking, and asking those questions. Can I in return ask one question to you guys? Do we have time for that? Yes, I see my screen saying yes. So those stories are about South Africa, and I guess my voice, or my ghost, or my hologram is going to circulate in Brazil. I was wondering how those themes or elements, or if we want to push that a little bit further, that logic of commodification, extraction, exploitation, the weight of history, and the greed of turning animals into something that's valuable and mercantile. How does that echo with what's happening in Brazil right now in your own field works? I'll be very curious to try to start bridging those continents.
Obrigado, David. Bom, eu posso te responder rapidamente aqui, com base nas coisas que eu tenho pesquisado, não necessariamente no Brasil, mas na Europa, né? Na Europa Ibérica, em Portugal, que, enfim, tenho trabalhado com processos, né, de renaturalização da Europa, né? Enfim, mudanças que pressupõem, inclusive, alterações de atividades econômicas, né, de uma determinada ruralidade portuguesa, porque não dizer ibérica, né, e que tem justamente a lógica de você transformar esses troféus de caça, que são exatamente os animais taxidermizados, que das pessoas que habitam, né, aqueles locais do interior de Portugal possuem ainda hoje, né, em cima das suas lareiras, dentro de casa, mas essas pessoas serem captadas, né, para mudar o tipo de operação econômica, né, mudando para oferecerem experiências com a natureza, né, ou seja, serem, de certa maneira, pessoas que recebam outros interessados no turismo ecológico, e que são pessoas que possam, de certa maneira, ter algum tipo de retribuição financeira ao receber esses turistas. Então, acho que a lógica um pouco passa pela dinâmica da experiência, né? Eu tenho pesquisado como é que essas pessoas, né, esses habitantes do interior de Portugal, operam, né, nessa passagem da lógica de você ter a natureza enquanto um troféu dentro de casa, mas transformar a experiência com a natureza no próprio troféu, né, e compartilhar isso com um público mais amplo. Então, eu acho que esse é o tipo de comodificação que tem acontecido no lugar onde eu tenho pesquisado, né, ou seja, a comodificação não tanto dos animais propriamente, mas de uma experiência com a natureza. E, evidentemente, isso faz parte de uma mudança da relação dos troféus de caça, né, passando por uma espécie de troféu de experiência natural.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we will be able to continue that conversation one way or another, maybe
Sure.
in real person.
I hope so.
We've exchanged as ghosts can exchange sometimes, and it's interesting too.
Fine. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you so much, David, for your generosity and for the conversation.
Well, it's a collective work.
Bom, mais uma vez eu gostaria de agradecer ao David, a Juliana e ao Guilherme pela presença e participação no Oitava React, e também pelas questões muito interessantes e pela ótima conversa.